In the early evening hours of October 2024, inside the Huntsville unit near Huntsville, Texas, Garcia Glenn White lay strapped to a table in the execution chamber. At exactly 6:39 p.m., the state of Texas executed him by giving him a drug called pentobarbital that makes people fall asleep and then stops their heart. He was 61 years old, a man who had spent 28 years waiting to die, longer than most, and whose story showed how drug addiction can change gentle people into killers. His story was full of opposites. White committed his first murder at age 26, not as someone who had always been violent, but as a former high school football star and college athlete whose dreams fell apart after he hurt his knee. Someone his brothers, sisters, and friends remembered as kind and never violent. For 28 years, he was on death row, knowing he would be executed. But during all that time in prison, he never caused problems, never hurt anyone, read the Bible, and talked about God with other prisoners. Yet none of that erased the crimes that put him there. A mother and her twin daughters stabbed to death in their apartment. The girls just one day past their 16th birthday when they heard their mother being attacked and tried to run away. In fact, one of the twin was raped even in death. Another woman who sold sex beaten so badly no one could recognize her face, left rolled in a carpet in an empty house. A Vietnamese immigrant father of 7 beaten to death during a store robbery, dying days later while his young son watched helplessly. 5 victims whose families waited decades for justice. As the drug flowed through tubes into his body, people watching said White's breathing became hard within minutes. But before the drugs started, he had said sorry to the victims' families, admitted what he had done, and sang a church song called "I Trust in God," while moving his tied-down hand and foot to the rhythm. One last sign of the faith he had found during all those years in a cell. White's path from promising athlete and family man to death row prisoner made him part of a common American story. He was one of thousands whose lives were destroyed by the crack cocaine problem that hit Houston hard in the late 1980s, and one of hundreds on Texas death row who only became violent after drugs took over. His lawyer said throughout all the court cases that White's violence only happened when he was high on crack, pointing to his perfect behavior in prison as proof he was safe when sober. But prosecutors saw a pattern in 5 murders over 6 years that showed planned evil rather than just drug-fueled mistakes. But to understand how a former college football player, described by everyone who knew him as gentle and kind, became responsible for 5 brutal murders, how the deadly mix of crack cocaine addiction and mental health problems created a perfect storm of violence, and whether the death penalty makes sense when someone's crimes happen during drug addiction while they cause no trouble when sober, we have to go back. Back to February 4th, 1963. Back to when Garcia Glenn White was born in Houston, Texas. Back through his childhood as one of 7 children in a loving home, through his high school football success, through the knee injury that ended his dreams, through the work accident that hurt his brain, and finally to autumn 1989. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. Garcia Glenn White was born on February 4, 1963, in Houston, Texas. He grew up as one of 7 children in what court records describe as a loving household. His mother worked hard to provide for the family, and neighbors remembered the White children as generally well-behaved. Young Garcia showed promise on the football field. At Wheatley High School, he became known for his athletic ability. Teachers noted he struggled academically, but his dedication to sports set him apart. His coaches saw potential in the tall, strong teenager who showed up to practice ready to work. Football became Garcia's ticket out. Lubbock Christian University offered him a spot on their team, and he left Houston with dreams of a college career. His siblings were proud. His mother believed education and sports would give him opportunities she never had. But dreams can collapse quickly. During his first semester, Garcia suffered a severe knee injury on the field. The damage ended his football career before it truly began. Without the structure of the team and facing academic challenges he couldn't overcome, Garcia dropped out of Lubbock Christian University. He returned to Houston, but the young man who came back was different from the one who had left. The injury had taken more than his athletic future. It had taken his sense of purpose. Garcia moved between jobs, working as a fry cook at local restaurants. The work was hard and the pay was low. In March 1988, another accident changed his trajectory. Garcia fell at work, sustaining injuries to his hand, shoulder, and head. The head injury required hospitalization. Medical records from this period would later become important in court proceedings. After recovering, he found work as a house painter and later as a sandblaster. By 1989, Garcia White was spending time in crack houses across Houston. These locations served as gathering spots where users could buy and consume drugs away from police attention. The apartments were often run down, filled with people whose lives had been overtaken by addiction. Garcia became a regular presence in these spaces. His mother tried to intervene. His siblings attempted to help. But crack cocaine's grip proved stronger than family bonds. Garcia's behavior became increasingly unpredictable when he was high. The man who had once been described as gentle was transforming into someone his family barely recognized. The crack houses attracted people from all walks of life. Some were neighborhood residents who had fallen into addiction. Others traveled from different parts of the city, seeking places to use drugs safely. Women exchanged sex for crack or money. Men committed robberies to fund their habits. Everyone was trapped in the same cycle of desperation. Garcia moved between these locations, always searching for his next high. He knew the other regulars by face, if not by name. Among the faces Garcia encountered in Houston's crack house circuit was Greta Williams. She had arrived in the city from Chicago in early 1989. At 27 years old, she was trying to build a new life in Texas. Her sister DeWanta Washington would later tell reporters that Greta was full of hope about the fresh start. She had left behind troubles in Chicago and believed Houston offered better opportunities. But Houston proved harder than Greta expected. She struggled to find stable work. The jobs available paid minimum wage and required references she did not have. Rent was due every month, whether she had income or not. Like many women in desperate circumstances, she turned to survival sex work to pay for food and rent. The streets of Houston in 1989 were dangerous for women in her situation. Violence against sex workers often went unreported and uninvestigated. Somewhere along the way, Greta began using crack cocaine. Maybe a client introduced her to it. Maybe she tried it to cope with the stress and danger of her life. Maybe someone offered it as payment. However it started, the drug pulled her deeper into a world she had not planned to enter. Greta's path crossed with Garcia Glenn White's in the crack house circuit. Both were caught in the cycle of addiction that defined Houston's drug epidemic. They existed in the same spaces, sometimes in the same rooms, both struggling with demons that had taken control of their lives. In these spaces, arguments could erupt over small amounts of money or drugs. Tensions ran high, and violence simmered just beneath the surface. During autumn 1989, Greta and Garcia had an argument over money. The exact details of what sparked the confrontation remain unclear. What is known is that the argument escalated quickly. He struck Greta multiple times with his fists. The beating was brutal. Greta Williams died from her injuries. Garcia, in a panic about what he had done, rolled her body in a carpet. He transported the carpet-wrapped body to a vacant house in the neighborhood. There, he left Greta's remains, hoping they would not be discovered or connected to him. Days later, someone found the body. Houston police responded to the vacant property. When they unwrapped the carpet, they discovered Greta Williams. Her sister DeWanta would later say that Greta had been beaten beyond recognition. The violence inflicted on her body shocked even experienced homicide detectives. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood. They learned that Greta had been seen in the area's crack houses. They developed a list of people who might have information. Garcia Glenn White's name appeared on that list. He lived near the vacant house where Greta's body was discovered. Police brought Garcia in for questioning. He denied any involvement in Greta Williams' death. Without physical evidence connecting him to the scene and without witnesses willing to come forward, detectives could not build a case. The investigation stalled. A grand jury reviewed the evidence against Garcia in late 1989. District Attorney Johnny Holmes presented what information police had gathered. The grand jury declined to indict Garcia White for Greta Williams' murder. There simply was not enough evidence to proceed to trial. Garcia walked free. Greta's family was devastated. They knew someone had killed their loved one with extreme violence, but justice seemed impossible. DeWanta Washington and other family members tried to keep Greta's case in the public eye, but in a city dealing with hundreds of murders each year, one dead sex worker quickly became another cold case file. Garcia returned to the streets. The lack of consequences for Greta Williams' death may have convinced him he could get away with violence. His drug use continued. His time in crack houses increased. The cycle that had claimed Greta's life showed no signs of stopping. Garcia moved through Houston's underground drug network, a familiar face in apartments where crack cocaine was bought, sold, and consumed. One of these locations was a modest apartment in northeast Houston. The woman who lived there was named Benita Edwards. She was 38 years old, a widow struggling to raise twin daughters alone. Like the other crack houses Garcia frequented, Benita's apartment served as a gathering place for users. People came and went, seeking temporary escape from their troubles through drugs. Benita Edwards lived in that modest northeast Houston apartment with her twin daughters, Annette and Burnett. The girls had just turned 16 in late November 1989. Both were students trying to navigate the challenges of teenage life in a neighborhood marked by poverty and drugs. Their mother's apartment had become one more stop on Garcia Glenn White's destructive path through the city. Benita had become a widow years earlier. Raising twin daughters alone proved difficult. Money was always tight. She was unemployed and struggled to make ends meet. The stress of single parenthood in challenging circumstances wore on her. Like many people in her situation, Benita occasionally used drugs as an escape. Her apartment became one of the informal gathering spots in the neighborhood. People would come to use drugs, particularly crack cocaine. Annette and Burnett hated this aspect of their home life. Court records show the twins had asked their grandmother if they could move in with her. They wanted to escape the parade of users who came through their apartment. The girls were protective of each other in the way that twins often are. They shared a bedroom in the small apartment. They tried to stay out of their mother's way when she had visitors. They focused on school and dreamed of futures beyond their current circumstances. King Solomon was Benita's boyfriend. He did not live in the apartment but visited regularly. He cared about Benita and worried about her drug use. He tried to check on her often, concerned about her well-being and that of her daughters. Garcia Glenn White had been coming to Benita's apartment for several weeks. He would bring crack cocaine or money to buy it. Sometimes he and Benita would have sex in exchange for drugs or cash. This transactional relationship was common in the crack house economy. Annette and Burnett knew who Garcia was, though they tried to avoid him when he visited. On November 30th, 1989, Garcia arrived at the Edwards apartment. He wanted to smoke crack with Benita and expected sex in return. Benita became angry during this visit. The specific cause of her anger remains disputed. Garcia claims she wanted him to share more drugs with her. Other evidence suggests she may have been trying to end their arrangement. The argument escalated. Voices were raised in the living room of the small apartment. In their shared bedroom, Annette and Burnett heard their mother's distress. The twins knew from experience that arguments in crack houses could turn violent without warning. What happened next would haunt Houston for years. Garcia Glenn White had a knife in his pocket when he visited the Edwards apartment that evening. Garcia stabbed Benita Edwards multiple times in the neck and chest. Blood sprayed across the living room walls. Benita collapsed, bleeding heavily from numerous wounds. The attack was frenzied and brutal. Any one of several stab wounds would have been fatal. In their bedroom, Annette and Burnett heard the sounds of violence. They heard their mother's cries. The twins emerged from their room to see what was happening. They found their mother on the floor, surrounded by blood, and Garcia White standing over her with a knife. The girls screamed. Garcia later told police that he panicked when he saw them. In his confession, he claimed the twins ran toward their bedroom. He chased after them. Annette made it to the bedroom. Garcia followed her inside and attacked her on the bed. Annette suffered multiple stab wounds. She was sexually assaulted. Burnett tried to escape to the bathroom. Garcia pursued her. The small bathroom became her final refuge. She fought back. Garcia overpowered her. He stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and chest. Garcia left all 3 bodies in the apartment. Blood covered the walls, the bathtub, and the kitchen sink. The phone had been knocked off the hook during the struggle. The bedroom door was broken from being forced open. The scene spoke to desperation and violence. Garcia fled the apartment, leaving the door unlocked. He walked out into the Houston night carrying the knife and wearing clothes stained with blood. No neighbors reported seeing him leave. Garcia went home. He cleaned himself up. He disposed of the knife and his bloody clothing. Then he went about his life as if nothing had happened. His family noticed nothing unusual about his behavior. King Solomon tried calling Bonita Edwards on November 30th. The phone rang, but no one answered. This was unusual, but not alarming enough to prompt immediate action. He tried again on December 1st. Still no answer. By December 2nd, Solomon's concern had grown into worry. He drove to Bonita's apartment in northeast Houston. He knocked on the door, no response. He knocked harder, calling out Bonita's name. Silence. Solomon walked around the apartment complex, asking neighbors if they had seen Bonita or the twins. No one had seen any of the Edwards family members in days. Solomon found a maintenance worker and explained his concern. Together, they approached the apartment manager. Solomon's worry convinced them that something might be wrong. The manager retrieved keys and agreed to open the apartment. It was approximately 2:45 p.m. on December 2nd, 1989. The door opened. The smell hit them immediately. King Solomon looked inside and saw 2 bodies on the floor. He saw blood everywhere. The maintenance worker and apartment manager quickly called for help. Houston Police Department units were dispatched to the scene. Officer Leonard Dawson arrived first. He entered the apartment and immediately recognized this as a major crime scene. He radioed for homicide detectives and crime scene technicians. He secured the apartment and began establishing a perimeter. Curious neighbors gathered outside, trying to see what had happened. Homicide detectives arrived and began their preliminary assessment. Bonita Edwards lay in the living room, fully clothed but covered in dried blood. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to her neck and chest. The number and placement of wounds indicated a frenzied attack. In the bedroom, detectives found Annette Edwards lying face down. She was semi-nude with her head on a pillow. A blanket partially covered her body. Blood had soaked into the bedding. Stab wounds to her neck and chest were visible. The positioning and state of undress suggested sexual assault. Burnett Edwards was found in the bathroom. A towel was wrapped around her neck and gagged her mouth. Like her mother and sister, she had suffered multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed she had fought her attacker. Blood splatter covered the bathroom walls and was present in the bathtub. Crime scene technicians photographed everything. They collected blood samples from multiple locations. They bagged the bedding where Annette had been found. They noted that the phone was off the hook. They documented the broken bedroom door. Every detail was recorded and preserved. The medical examiner arrived to examine the bodies before they were transported. Preliminary time of death estimates suggested the victims had been dead for approximately 3 days. The apartment had no air conditioning, and the Houston heat had accelerated decomposition. The crime scene was difficult even for experienced investigators. Sergeant Brad Rudolph, an investigator with Houston Police Department, examined the scene carefully. Rudolph ordered collection of all potential DNA evidence. In 1989, DNA testing was still relatively new in criminal investigations, but Houston Police Department had begun using the technology. Samples were collected from Annette's body and from the bedding. Blood evidence was everywhere, on the walls, in the kitchen sink, in the bathtub, on the floors. Technicians collected samples from multiple locations, hoping to find evidence that might belong to the killer. With 3 victims and that much blood, there was a possibility the attacker had cut himself during the violence. Detectives canvassed the apartment complex. They knocked on doors and asked if anyone had heard or seen anything unusual on November 30th or in the days following. Most neighbors claimed to have heard nothing. Houston Police Department homicide detectives faced a complex crime scene. 3 victims, all from the same family, murdered in their own home. The brutality of the attack suggested rage or panic. The sexual assault component added another dimension to the investigation. Lead investigators began by building victimology reports. They needed to understand who Benita, Annette, and Burnett Edwards were. Who were their friends? Who visited the apartment? Who might have wanted to harm them? King Solomon provided crucial early information about Benita's life and her struggles. Solomon told detectives about Benita's drug use. He explained that the apartment sometimes served as a place where people gathered to use crack cocaine. He provided names of people he knew had visited the apartment. This information opened up a wide pool of potential suspects. Detectives interviewed the twins' friends and schoolmates. Annette and Burnett had kept largely to themselves at school. They were not involved in any conflicts or drama that might explain someone targeting them. Teachers described them as quiet students who seemed burdened by their home life but caused no problems. The lack of forced entry kept bringing investigators back to one conclusion. The killer was someone the Edwards family knew. Someone they had allowed into their apartment. Someone who had been there before. Someone whose presence would not alarm them. Crime scene technicians processed all physical evidence. Blood samples went to the Houston Police Department Crime Lab for analysis. DNA testing in 1989 took weeks or months, not the hours or days that modern testing requires. Detectives knew they would have to wait for results. The broken bedroom door told part of the story. Annette or Burnett, or perhaps both girls, had tried to lock themselves in their bedroom. The killer had forced the door open. This suggested the attack on Benita happened first, and the twins tried to escape the violence. Medical examiner reports confirmed what detectives already suspected. Benita Edwards had died from multiple stab wounds. Either the neck wounds or several of the chest wounds would have been individually fatal. She had been stabbed at least 13 times. The attack was personal and violent. Annette Edwards had suffered 2 stab wounds to the neck and 11 to the chest. Additional wounds on her arms and hands suggested she tried to defend herself. The medical examiner confirmed sexual assault. Evidence was collected for DNA analysis. The violence inflicted on this 16-year-old girl was extensive. Burnett Edwards had similar injuries. Multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest, defensive wounds on her hands and arms. The towel around her neck and in her mouth had been placed there during or after the attack. She had fought for her life in that small bathroom. Detectives theorized about the sequence of events. Most likely, the killer had argued with Benita in the living room. The argument turned violent, and he stabbed her. The twins heard the commotion and came out to see what was happening. The killer, now committed to violence and perhaps worried about witnesses, attacked them as well. The sexual assault of Annette suggested the killer had taken time during or after the murders. This indicated someone comfortable enough at the scene to not rush his exit. Someone who believed he could get away with the crimes. Investigators pulled together a list of known associates of Benita Edwards. They cross-referenced this with people who had criminal records for violence. Several names stood out. Garcia Glenn White was one of them. He had recently been investigated for the murder of Greta Williams. He was known to frequent crack houses in the area. He fit the profile. Detectives brought Garcia in for questioning. He was asked about his relationship with Benita Edwards. He admitted knowing her and visiting her apartment occasionally, but he denied any involvement in the murders. Without physical evidence linking him to the scene at that moment, detectives had to let him go. The investigation expanded. Other potential suspects were questioned. Each lead was followed. But as weeks turned into months without a break in the case, the Edwards family murders joined the growing stack of unsolved homicides in Houston. The case went cold. The Edwards family murders remained unsolved through 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, and 1994. The case file sat in the Houston Police Department's cold case section. Detectives moved on to new investigations. The public's attention shifted to other crimes, but the families of Benita, Annette, and Burnett never forgot. King Solomon struggled with guilt. He wondered if he had visited the apartment sooner on November 30th. Might he have prevented the murders? Could he have saved them? The questions haunted him. He gave occasional interviews to local media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. No one did. Garcia Glenn White continued living in Houston. He remained involved in the drug scene. His addiction to crack cocaine persisted. His family continued trying to help him, unaware that he had murdered 4 people by the end of 1989. To them, he was still their brother, their son, struggling with addiction but not beyond redemption. In 1995, Garcia's addiction had drained whatever financial resources he had. He needed money to buy drugs. Robbery seemed like a solution. He recruited an acquaintance named Tecumseh Manuel to help. The two men targeted a convenience store in Houston. On July 13, 1995, Garcia and Tecumseh entered the Village Food Market at 3115 Roland Street. Behind the counter stood 52-year-old Hai Van Pham. He had immigrated to the United States from Vietnam just 9 months earlier. He worked long hours at the convenience store to support his wife and 7 children. His dream was to give his family a better life than they had known in Vietnam. Garcia and Tecumseh demanded money from the cash register. Hai Pham tried to comply, but something went wrong. He beat the shopkeeper with brutal force. A chair broke during the struggle. Blood splattered across the floor. Hai's son, who was in the back room of the store, heard the commotion. He came out to find his father on the floor with blood in his eyes, barely conscious. The robbers fled with whatever money they had grabbed. Hai Van Pham was rushed to the hospital with severe head injuries. Doctors tried to save him, but the damage was too extensive. Hai died from his injuries within days of the robbery. His family was devastated. They had come to America seeking safety and opportunity. Instead, they lost a husband and father to senseless violence. Before we continue with how this case unfolded, if you're finding this documentary informative, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more detailed, true crime content that examines these cases thoroughly. Let's continue. Houston Police Department responded to the convenience store robbery and murder. Officer James Croson arrived at the scene. He documented what had happened. The investigation began immediately. Unlike the Edwards case, this crime had a witness. Hai Pham's son had seen the attackers, though his trauma made getting clear descriptions difficult. Detectives worked the case hard. Convenience store robberies that turned into murders were too common in Houston, but each one demanded thorough investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. They checked surveillance footage from nearby businesses. They developed leads. One lead pointed toward Garcia Glenn White and Tecumseh Manuel. Both men were known in the area. Both had drug problems that might motivate robbery. Detectives brought them in for questioning on July 21, 1995, 8 days after the robbery. Detective Todd Miller sat across from Tecumseh Manuel in an interview room at Houston Police Department headquarters. Manuel was nervous. He knew he was facing serious charges for the Hai Pham robbery and murder. Miller had years of experience reading suspects. He saw an opportunity. Manuel and Garcia Glenn White had been friends for years. They had grown up in the same neighborhood. Manuel knew Garcia as well as anyone. Miller began asking questions about their friendship, about what they did together, about what Garcia had told him over the years. Manuel talked about their drug use together. He mentioned various crimes they had discussed. And then, perhaps hoping to deflect attention from his own role in Hai Pham's murder, Manuel said something that would finally solve a 6-year-old cold case. He told Detective Miller that Garcia had confessed to killing Benita Edwards and her twin daughters. Miller stopped. This was unexpected. The Edwards case was still open, still unsolved. The Homicide Division would be very interested in this information. Miller asked Manuel to repeat what he had just said. Manuel confirmed it. Garcia Glenn White had told him about murdering the Edwards family. According to Manuel, Garcia had visited him sometime in late 1989 or early 1990. During a conversation about various things they had done, Garcia mentioned stabbing a woman and her twin daughters. Manuel said Garcia had described going to an apartment in northeast Houston where things went wrong. Miller pressed for details. What exactly had Garcia said? Manuel's memory was fuzzy on specifics after 6 years, but he was certain about the basic facts. Garcia had admitted killing 3 people, an adult woman and her teenage twin daughters. The details matched the Edwards case. Miller called in detectives from the homicide unit who had worked the Edwards investigation. They came immediately. They interviewed Manuel separately, asking detailed questions about what Garcia had told him. Manuel repeated his account. Garcia Glenn White had confessed to the murders during a conversation between friends. Detectives faced a decision. They could approach Garcia directly and confront him with Manuel's statement. But there was risk in this strategy. If Garcia denied everything and refused to talk, they might not have enough evidence to charge him. Manuel's testimony alone might not be sufficient for conviction. They needed more. The DNA evidence from the Edwards apartment had been stored since 1989. Testing had been done at the time, but there had been no suspect to compare it against. Now they had a suspect. Detective Miller obtained a court order for a DNA sample from Garcia Glenn White. On July 21, 1995, police officially arrested Garcia Glenn White. They read him his Miranda rights. They transported him to headquarters. Garcia initially was told he was being arrested for the high-fam robbery and murder. He said little during the booking process. Once Garcia was in custody, detectives had an opportunity. They had Manuel's statement. They had DNA evidence waiting to be compared. They needed Garcia's confession to seal the case. Detective Miller and his colleagues prepared for what would be one of the most important interrogations in their careers. Garcia sat in an interview room. He was told that Tecumseh Manuel had been arrested and had provided information to police. Garcia seemed unconcerned. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the high-fam robbery. He suggested that Manuel was lying to save himself. Then detectives shifted the conversation. They asked Garcia about Benita Edwards. They mentioned the names Annette and Burnett. Garcia's demeanor changed. He became quieter. The detectives knew they had touched something. They told Garcia that they knew about the Edwards murders. They said they had evidence placing him at the scene. They mentioned the DNA evidence, though at that point it had not yet been compared to Garcia's sample. They suggested that cooperation would help his situation. Detectives had seen a portion of Tecumseh Manuel's videotaped statement. The decision was made to show part of it to Garcia. When Garcia saw his longtime friend implicating him in the Edwards murders, something shifted. According to police reports, Garcia said he was ready to tell the truth. The interrogation was videotaped, standard procedure for major cases. Garcia began talking. His confession would become crucial evidence in his eventual trial. But the version of events he provided in that first confession was not entirely truthful. Garcia claimed he had not acted alone. According to Garcia's initial statement, he and a man named Terrence Moore went to Benita Edwards' apartment in late November 1989. He said they intended to use drugs and have sex with Benita. When they arrived, they smoked crack cocaine with her. An argument began when Benita became angry that Garcia and Terrence would not share more drugs with her. Garcia told detectives that Terrence Moore pulled out a knife and stabbed Benita Edwards. He claimed Moore initiated the violence, not him. When Annette and Burnett came out of their bedroom to see what was happening, Garcia said Moore grabbed one of the twins while Garcia grabbed the other. In this version, Garcia admitted to sexual contact with one of the victims. He said he fondled one of the girls and ejaculated, but he maintained that Terrence Moore did the actual stabbing of the twins. He described Moore forcing his way into the bedroom and attacking the girls with the knife while Garcia stood by, paralyzed by what was happening. Detectives listened to this account. They took detailed notes. They asked follow-up questions about Terrence Moore. Where did he live? How could they find him? Garcia provided information about Moore. The interview concluded with Garcia having given a full videotaped confession implicating himself and Moore in the triple murder. Detectives immediately began looking for Terrence Moore. They needed to verify Garcia's account. They needed to determine Moore's role in the murders. They checked police databases, ran his name through various systems, and contacted people who might know his whereabouts. What they discovered changed everything. Terrence Moore was dead. He had been killed in July 1989, 4 months before the Edwards family murders. There was no way Moore could have participated in murders that occurred in November 1989. Garcia Glenn White had lied about having an accomplice. Detectives confronted Garcia with this information. Moore could not have been at the Edwards apartment in November because Moore was already dead. Garcia's story fell apart. The detectives gave Garcia an opportunity to tell the truth this time. They explained that lying would only make his situation worse. Garcia requested a break. He sat in the interview room alone while detectives stepped out. Cameras continued recording. Garcia could be seen thinking, perhaps weighing his options. When detectives returned, Garcia was ready to give a new statement. In his second videotaped confession, Garcia admitted that the story about Terrence Moore was fabricated. He had acted alone. He went to Benita Edwards' apartment by himself on November 30, 1989. He had gone there intending to smoke crack cocaine with her and have sex. An argument began between him and Benita. Garcia claimed in this version that Benita reached for a knife first, and he grabbed it from her. He said he acted in self-defense when he stabbed her. But once Benita was down, the situation escalated beyond any reasonable claim of self-defense. The twins heard their mother being attacked and came out of their bedroom. Garcia described how they screamed when they saw what was happening. He claimed he panicked. He chased the girls. One made it to the bedroom, one to the bathroom. Garcia admitted to stabbing both of them multiple times. He confessed to sexually assaulting Annette Edwards. He described the details in a way that matched the physical evidence found at the scene. He admitted to fleeing the apartment after the murders, leaving all 3 bodies where they fell. He said he disposed of the knife and his bloody clothes. This second confession provided prosecutors with a complete account of the murders from the perpetrator himself. But questions remained about whether Garcia's intellectual capacity affected his ability to understand his rights and make informed decisions during the interrogation. Detectives had Garcia Glenn White's confession, but prosecutors needed more to ensure a conviction. Confessions can be challenged in court. Defense attorneys might argue coercion or that a defendant did not understand their rights. Physical evidence was essential to corroborate Garcia's admission. The DNA samples collected from Annette Edwards' body and the bedding in 1989 had been preserved. In 1995, DNA technology had advanced significantly from 6 years earlier. The Houston Police Department Crime Lab could now conduct more sophisticated testing and provide probability statistics about matches. Lab technicians compared Garcia's DNA sample with the semen recovered from the crime scene. The testing took several weeks to complete properly. When results came back, they were definitive. Garcia Glenn White's DNA matched the biological evidence from Annette Edwards' body. The probability that the semen belonged to someone other than Garcia was calculated at 0.0001%, or a 99.9999% certainty it was his. Blood samples from the scene were also analyzed. Some of the blood matched Annette's DNA profile. Some matched Burnett's profile. The blood evidence confirmed that both girls had been wounded in multiple locations throughout the apartment, consistent with Garcia's confession about chasing them. Prosecutors faced a strategic decision. Garcia had confessed to murdering 3 people: Benita Edwards, Annette Edwards, and Burnett Edwards. But Texas law provided prosecutors with options about how to charge the case. Under Texas capital murder statutes, killing multiple people in the same criminal transaction could result in the death penalty. The decision was made to charge Garcia Glenn White specifically with the murders of Annette Edwards and Burnett Edwards. The charge was capital murder of multiple persons. This charging decision had important implications. It focused the case on the deaths of two 16-year-old girls, victims who would generate sympathy from a jury. The sexual assault component added to the heinousness of the crimes. Prosecutors still had the murder of Bonita Edwards in their case. But by making Bonita's death part of the narrative rather than a specific charge, they simplified the legal issues. They also avoided potential defense arguments that Bonita's death might have begun as an argument that escalated, potentially reducing culpability. The other murders that Garcia was connected to became important for a different reason. Texas law allows evidence of prior bad acts to be introduced during the punishment phase of capital murder trials. If a jury found Garcia guilty, they would then hear about other crimes he committed to help them decide whether he should receive the death penalty. Prosecutors prepared to present evidence about Greta Williams's murder during the punishment phase. Garcia had confessed to killing her in 1989. Even though he had not been charged with that murder, the jury could hear about it when deciding his sentence. The same applied to Hy Van Fam's death. The robbery gone wrong that led to Hy's death would be presented as evidence of Garcia's continuing danger to society. On May 28, 1996, a grand jury indicted Garcia for capital murder, and he was appointed Patrick McCann as his defense attorney. McCann focused on preventing a death sentence by building a case about who Garcia was and whether he could be safely imprisoned for life. He obtained psychological evaluations showing Garcia had borderline intellectual functioning with an IQ of 76, though another evaluation placed it slightly higher at 85 to 87. The evaluations documented Garcia's cocaine dependency and how it affected his judgment. McCann investigated Garcia's background, finding someone who showed no violent tendencies before crack cocaine entered his life. He prepared to argue that Garcia's violence was linked to drug intoxication and that his good behavior in jail since arrest proved he could be safely incarcerated without access to drugs. However, McCann faced enormous challenges given the brutal nature of the crimes, the sexual assault of a teenage girl, and prosecution plans to present evidence of 5 total murders during the punishment phase. July 1996 arrived with oppressive Houston heat. Inside the Harris County Courthouse, air conditioning kept the courtroom comfortable, but the atmosphere was tense. Garcia Glenn White sat at the defense table wearing jail clothing. His family filled several rows in the spectator section. On the other side of the courtroom, members of the victims' families waited for justice. Jury selection took several days, with jurors required to be death qualified and willing to consider imposing a death sentence. Patrick McCann later argued that prosecutors systematically eliminated African American jurors from the panel, though his objections were overruled. Prosecutors methodically presented their case, starting with King Solomon's testimony about discovering the bodies, followed by police officers and crime scene technicians who described the blood-soaked apartment. The medical examiner detailed how Bonita was stabbed 13 times and both twins suffered multiple fatal wounds, with Annette showing evidence of sexual assault. DNA experts testified that the probability the semen found on Annette belonged to anyone other than Garcia was essentially 0. Detective Todd Miller explained the 6-year cold case and how Tecumseh Manuel's tip broke it open. The videotaped confessions showed Garcia first blaming Terrence Moore, then admitting the truth. McCann's cross-examination focused on Garcia's intellectual limitations and whether he fully understood his rights during interrogation, laying groundwork for future appeals. The guilt phase lasted only days because the evidence was overwhelming. Garcia's mother testified tearfully about her son before drugs, and Dr. Yeoman explained his borderline IQ and cocaine dependency. But prosecutors countered that Garcia had functioned well enough to hide his crimes for 6 years and plan the fam robbery. On July 18, 1996, the jury found Garcia guilty of capital murder. The punishment phase then began, where prosecutors had to prove Garcia posed a continuing threat to society. They presented evidence of all 5 murders, with DeWanta Washington describing finding her sister Greta beaten beyond recognition, and Hyvon Phom's son testifying about watching his father die from the robbery. Prosecutors argued Garcia was a serial killer who could kill again, even in prison. McCann countered with evidence of Garcia's excellent behavior in jail since arrest, with guards testifying he was polite and cooperative, and Dr. Yeoman explaining the violence only emerged when Garcia was high on crack cocaine. Family members described the gentle person Garcia had been before addiction, but prosecutors pointed out that the fam robbery occurred when Garcia was sober, suggesting his capacity for violence existed independent of drug intoxication. The jury deliberated on punishment for longer than they had deliberated on guilt. This was a life or death decision. Even jurors who supported the death penalty in principle might hesitate before actually imposing it. They had to be certain that execution was the appropriate punishment. On July 23, 1996, 5 days after the guilty verdict, the jury returned with their decision on punishment. They answered the special issues required under Texas law. Yes, Garcia Glenn White posed a continuing threat to society. Yes, he had acted deliberately. No, there were not sufficient mitigating circumstances to warrant a life sentence instead of death. The judge formally sentenced Garcia Glenn White to death by lethal injection. Garcia showed little emotion as the sentence was pronounced. His family sobbed in the courtroom. Members of the victims' families felt relief that justice had been served, though no sentence could bring back their loved ones. Garcia was transported to Texas death row. He would be housed at the Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas. Death row inmates in Texas spend 23 hours per day in their cells. They have limited contact with other prisoners. They wait, sometimes for decades, while appeals work through the courts. Patrick McCann immediately began the appeals process. Every death sentence in Texas is automatically reviewed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. McCann filed paperwork arguing that errors in the trial warranted either a new trial or reduction of sentence to life imprisonment. The automatic appeal focused on several issues. McCann argued that the jury selection process had improperly excluded African American jurors. He challenged the admission of certain evidence. He argued that Garcia's confession should have been suppressed due to his intellectual limitations. Each argument was carefully documented with references to the trial record. On June 17, 1998, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued its decision. The court affirmed both Garcia's conviction and death sentence. The judges found no reversible error in the trial. The evidence had been properly admitted. The jury had been properly instructed. The sentence was appropriate given the nature of the crimes. McCann was not surprised, but remained determined. The next step was filing a state habeas corpus petition. This proceeding would allow Garcia to raise constitutional issues about his conviction and sentence. The petition was filed in the trial court that had convicted him. The state habeas petition raised new issues that had not been addressed on direct appeal. McCann argued that Garcia's trial attorney had provided ineffective assistance of counsel. He claimed that more should have been done to investigate Garcia's intellectual disability. He argued that the prosecution had withheld potentially exculpatory evidence. On February 21, 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Garcia's state habeas petition. The court found that trial counsel had performed adequately, given the overwhelming evidence of guilt. No constitutional violations had occurred that would warrant overturning the conviction or sentence. Garcia had now exhausted his state court appeals. The next avenue was federal court. McCann filed a federal habeas corpus petition in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas. Federal courts can review state criminal convictions to ensure constitutional rights were protected. The federal petition raised similar issues to those presented in state court. But federal courts give significant deference to state court decisions. Unless the state court's ruling was contrary to clearly established federal law or involved an unreasonable application of federal law, the federal court would not overturn it. Years passed while the federal petition was pending. Garcia remained on death row. He had visitors occasionally, mostly family members who had not abandoned him despite his crimes. He participated in prison programs when available. He reportedly became religious, attending services and studying scripture. On September 30, 2011, the federal district court issued a lengthy opinion denying Garcia's habeas petition. The court had reviewed all of Garcia's claims. While expressing sympathy for some of the defense arguments, the judge found no constitutional violation that required relief. The conviction and death sentence were affirmed. McCann appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This was Garcia's last realistic chance in federal court. The Fifth Circuit is known for being conservative on criminal justice issues. Very few death penalty appeals succeed at this level. On April 1, 2013, a three-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit denied Garcia's appeal. The judges found that the district court had correctly analyzed all issues. Garcia's constitutional rights had been protected throughout the trial and appeals process. No basis existed to overturn the state court's judgment. Garcia filed a petition for certiorari with the United States Supreme Court. This was a long shot. The Supreme Court accepts only a tiny fraction of petitions. Death penalty cases get more attention than most, but Garcia's case did not present novel legal issues that would interest the court. On January 13, 2014, the Supreme Court denied Garcia's petition without comment. This meant Garcia had exhausted all regular appeals. An execution date could now be set. On April 28, 2014, Judge Dashawn Jones signed an execution order setting Garcia's death for January 28, 2015, nearly 19 years after his original sentence. Patrick McCann filed a successive habeas corpus application focusing on new scientific research showing crack cocaine can cause psychotic symptoms in ways not understood in 1996, and raising an intellectual disability claim under Atkins v. Virginia, though Garcia's borderline IQ scores had not clearly qualified him as disabled earlier. McCann gathered affidavits from family members describing Garcia's cognitive limitations, but Fifth Circuit judges noted that if Garcia was truly intellectually disabled, his family would have come forward during the original trial, rather than waiting nearly 20 years. McCann also challenged the DNA evidence, pointing out that the scandal-plagued Houston Police Department crime lab had conducted tests that a private laboratory could not replicate in 2004, and that unknown male DNA was found on a blanket at the scene. On January 27, 2015, just one day before the scheduled execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay to consider whether new scientific evidence about cocaine's brain effects qualified under Article 11.073 for a successive habeas application, postponing Garcia's execution indefinitely while both sides filed extensive briefs. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals spent months thinking about whether new science about cocaine could be used to change a sentence or only to prove someone innocent. In December 2016, the court ruled that the law only allowed new evidence if it would prove someone shouldn't have been found guilty at all. So they threw out Garcia's request. McCann kept filing papers in federal court, but judges said no to his arguments. Through the late 2010s and into the 2020s, Garcia stayed on death row without a new execution date because Texas had so many people waiting to be executed. Other inmates who arrived after Garcia were executed before him. Garcia's behavior stayed good the whole time, with guards saying he caused no problems and spent his time reading religious books and writing letters to family. This raised questions about whether it made sense to execute someone who was only violent when using drugs. In 2017, Kim Ogg became the top prosecutor in Harris County and said that while she wouldn't seek the death penalty as often in new cases, people already sentenced to death would still be executed. On June 28, 2024, after Garcia had been on death row for 28 years, the judge signed papers setting his execution for October 1, 2024. On September 29, 2024, 3 days before the execution, McCann filed an emergency appeal raising intellectual disability, execution drug problems, and claims about racial bias in picking the jury. But 3 judges denied it on Sunday, saying Garcia had gotten full review over many years. McCann immediately filed papers with the Supreme Court on September 30th. while the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted against showing mercy on September 27th. Garcia spent his final days talking with visitors and other death row inmates. A report compiled by prison officials documented his activities. On Saturday night, September 28th, while a federal court considered his appeal, Garcia prayed in his cell. He wrote letters on Monday night and stayed awake most of the night, packing up his belongings and reading. On Tuesday afternoon, October 1st, the Supreme Court issued its decision. Without any public dissent or explanation, the court denied Garcia's petition for stay of execution. The last legal barrier had fallen. The execution would proceed as scheduled at 6 p.m. Garcia Glenn White was moved from his death row cell to a holding area near the execution chamber during the morning of October 1st. Prison procedures for executions follow a precise schedule. Garcia was allowed visits from a chaplain. He was offered a final meal, though Texas had stopped honoring special last meal requests in 2011. Patrick McCann visited Garcia one last time. The attorney who had represented him for nearly 3 decades said goodbye to his client. McCann later told reporters that Garcia had made a decision about witnesses. He did not want his family or friends present at the execution. He wanted to spare them from watching him die. McCann respected his client's wishes. He explained to Garcia's family that Garcia had asked them not to attend. Some family members wanted to be there anyway, but they honored Garcia's request. McCann believed this was a final selfless act by someone trying to protect people he loved from additional trauma. At the Huntsville unit, officials prepared the death chamber. The gurney where Garcia would be strapped down was positioned in the center of the room. I-4 lines were tested to ensure they would work properly. Witnesses began arriving at the prison, going through security, before being escorted to viewing areas. 5 members of Greta Williams's family came to witness the execution. 2 members of Hy Van Pham's family also attended. They wanted to see justice carried out for their loved ones who had been murdered by Garcia. Harris County District Attorney Tim Ogg arrived to observe on behalf of the victims. Representatives from the media were present as required by Texas law. Executions are witnessed by reporters who document what occurs. This transparency serves as a check against potential misconduct and provides a historical record of the state carrying out capital punishment. No member of the Edwards family attended. Benita's family chose not to witness the execution. The family of Annette and Burnett Edwards wanted justice but could not bring themselves to watch a man die, even the man who had murdered their loved ones. Their absence spoke to the complex emotions that victims' families experience. At approximately 6 p.m., Garcia was brought into the death chamber. He was strapped to the gurney with restraints on his arms, legs, and chest. IV lines were inserted into his arms. The drugs would flow through these lines when the warden gave the signal. Garcia could see the witnesses through windows, but they could not hear him yet. Texas protocol requires that the condemned person be given an opportunity to make a final statement. The warden asked Garcia if he wished to say anything. Garcia said yes. A microphone was positioned near his head so his words could be heard in the witness rooms. Garcia began speaking. His voice was steady despite the circumstances. He addressed the Edwards family first, even though they were not present. He apologized for the pain he had caused them. He expressed regret for his actions. He said he hoped they could find peace and closure. He took responsibility for what he had done. He thanked his own family and friends for their love and support through the years. He mentioned the prison guards and administration. He prayed for his fellow inmates on death row, asking them to continue supporting each other. His statement lasted several minutes. Then Garcia said he wanted to sing a hymn. The witnesses heard him begin singing, "I Trust in God." His voice carried through the death chamber. He tapped his restrained hand and foot to the rhythm of the hymn. For a moment, the clinical setting of the execution chamber transformed into something resembling a church service. When he finished the hymn, Garcia spoke a few more words to his family and friends. He told them to stay strong. He ended by saying, "Thank you, and I pray, that's it, Warden." At 6:39 p.m., the warden signaled to begin the execution. A technician in a separate room began injecting pentobarbital through the IV lines. The drug is a powerful barbiturate that causes unconsciousness, followed by respiratory and cardiac arrest. Texas uses a single drug protocol, having abandoned the three-drug cocktail used in earlier years. Garcia's breathing became labored within the first minute. His chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. Witnesses watched through the glass. Within 2 to 3 minutes, his breathing appeared to cease. His chest stopped moving. Medical personnel monitored his vital signs using equipment not visible to witnesses. The process continued for 17 minutes. At 6:56 p.m., a doctor entered the chamber and examined Garcia. He checked for a heartbeat and other vital signs. Finding none, he pronounced Garcia Glenn White dead. The warden noted the time of death in the official record. Garcia Glenn White, age 61, had been executed by the state of Texas. He had spent 28 years on death row. 35 years had passed since he murdered Bonita, Annette, and Burnett Edwards. Justice, delayed by decades of legal proceedings, had finally been served according to the sentence imposed by a Harris County jury in 1996. The witnesses were escorted out of the viewing areas. Family members of the victims declined to make public statements. Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg spoke to reporters on their behalf. She acknowledged that executions do not make victims' families whole, but the legal process had reached its conclusion. The suffering endured by surviving family members over decades was finally over. Thank you for watching this documentary. May we learn from this tragedy and work together to prevent such senseless violence in the future. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries that honor victims, examine the facts, and explore the human stories behind the headlines.